When I was younger, people used to quote The Godfather all the time for their life lessons. Keep your friends close, but your enemies closer and all that. But now people quote Seinfeld in a similar way. Those lines somehow apply to life even 35 years later.
I'm Justin Jay, and this is The Plug. In the early 1970s, Paramount studio head Robert Evans oversaw some of the most iconic films of the era: Rosemary's Baby, Chinatown, Love Story, and The Godfather. These movies defined a generation of cinema and cemented his reputation as a Hollywood player. Yet despite their success, Evans was essentially just an employee of the studio. He had no ownership stake, and he never shared in the profits. Today's guest knows that dynamic well. He was an instrumental voice behind some of the most beloved television shows in history. Working with Larry David, he co-wrote numerous episodes of Seinfeld and directed many episodes of Curb Your Enthusiasm. And even though the shows generated hundreds of millions of dollars in profit, like Evans, he received a fixed salary rather than any back-end compensation. He eventually turned to film, directing audacious, culture-defining projects like Bruno, Borat, and Religulous. Throughout his career, he stayed committed to a singular pursuit: unlocking what makes people laugh and approaching it with the intensity of a high-stakes mission. In his new book, Comedy Samurai, he reflects on a life spent in the writer's room and behind the camera, approaching comedy as a sacred discipline guided by risk, truth, failure, and redemption. So what did directing Borat and Bruno reveal about tolerance and about the simmering prejudice and violence in America? We'll find out as we sit down with the man behind some of pop culture's funniest and most subversive characters. Today, writer, director, producer, and comedy samurai, Mr. Larry Charles. Larry Charles, thanks for sitting down. I'm a big fan of your work, and I thoroughly enjoyed reading Comedy Samurai. So for any listener that's a fan of Seinfeld or Curb Your Enthusiasm or Borat or Bruno, this is a must-read. So many amazing stories in this book. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. Even if you hate those things, by the way, I think you'll still enjoy the book.
Yes, it's very insightful stories, whether you're a fan or not. Are you happy with how the book turned out and how the response has been so far?
Yeah, I've gotten, first of all, the book was originally 1,000 pages long, and it included, everything from my birth up until that first job on Fridays. And they told me you just can't have 1,000-page book. So rather than try to cut each chapter down and make it, I felt it would hurt it, I decided to just cut the book in half and make the first half of the book a separate book, which is what I'm doing. The response has been amazing. I get response from all kinds of people across the spectrum, people in show business, but many people who have no connection to show business at all, because they connect to the life lessons and the journey itself, So yes, it's been extremely satisfying, and I'm having a great time kind of interfacing with people who've checked out the book.
Well, I guess let's start at the top. I want to get into your motivation for writing Comedy Samurai, because it seems like a lot of people are motivated to write memoirs for a couple different reasons. It could be an act of self-reflection. It might be to secure their legacy. It might be the lure of a big payday. But it seems like in your case, I can't imagine the money was life-changing enough compared to the sheer amount of work that it takes to write something like this. And you've had a wildly interesting career. And it feels like you still got some fight left in you. Yes. Why did you think now is the right moment to put your story into a book?
I've had a kind of unique life, even going back before where the book starts, as I was talking about, the original 1,000-page manuscript. And I thought, well, this is it's unique. And yet at the same time, as I've discovered in writing things like Seinfeld, the more unique, the more specific your story is, the more relatable it is to a wide range of people. And I felt like I was in a good place to sit down and start to put all this down on paper. I mean, I've been keeping notes. I have a really good memory for whatever reason, very luckily. And I felt like I have a lot of unique experiences, and yet at the same time, very relatable kind of life experiences that I think people would respond to, and it resonates with people. And so I started to commit to paper, and, it started to work out that way.
One thing I got reading your book is that your approach to comedy and how you view comedy's role in society, it's something you take really seriously. I mean, and in the book, you really lean into the metaphor of you being a samurai, and you talk about comedy in terms of life and death and honor and dishonor and pride and shame. You even describe a successful sitcom as being almost like a church where people gather every Sunday to hear variations of essentially the same story.
Yes.
A cynic might say, well, comedy, it's disposable entertainment. Talk to me about why you feel comedy is so important, not just to you, but for a society.
Well, there's a few different reasons, a few different levels, and you've just touched upon a couple of them right there. I mean, I found that with things like Seinfeld or even Borat, people, or Curb, people really do need this kind of check-in once a week with these characters. They need to, it's a catharsis. It's some sort of like deeper resonant connection. And the proof of that is that we're still talking about those shows 35 years after the fact. So a lot of comedy is disposable. A lot of comedy is meaningless and empty and cheap and quick. But there is comedy that has substance and that has resonance, and that, whether it's Beckett or Seinfeld, it sort of has some kind of resonance with people, and they carry it with them, and it becomes like life lessons. When I was younger, people used to quote The Godfather all the time for their life lessons, keep your friends close, but your enemies closer, and all that. But now people quote Seinfeld in a similar way. Those lines somehow apply to life even 35 years later. So that's an important part of it. It does have some lasting substance. Not that I'm interested in legacy, but I am curious about the unique quality of something that has a long-lasting impact. The second part of it, which you also touched upon, and this is where I kind of ended the book, essentially, I did a show called Larry Charles' Dangerous World of Comedy, for Netflix, where I traveled to the most dangerous places I could possibly go to, like Somalia and Iraq and places like that. And because I realized doing Borat and doing commercials, and I've done all kinds of stuff in different countries, and wherever I was, even Muslim countries, even repressive regimes, there were always comedians who were plying their trade even under those conditions. And I thought that's a fascinating subject to examine. And so I did the show and went to places like Somalia and met comedians who were under siege, who'd been arrested, who'd been jailed. I talked to comedians whose friends who were comedians had been assassinated, people that were on the run, people that were in hiding, but continued doing their comedy one way or another. And I found that incredibly inspiring, and realized, and this was kind of the premise of the show, was that comedy has a healing power as well. And that people, even in Iraq, who were under siege, who were being attacked at all times, they needed to laugh. It was some kind of an outlet. It was some kind of a way to process the horrors around them. And it served a really important purpose. And the stakes of comedy under those conditions were extremely high. They were life and death. And that really inspired me. And that was part of the logic and the motivation to write the book.
I mean, what I found really interesting about your book is that you're very philosophical about the concept of comedy. I mean, the purpose and the process of creating something funny and why it resonates with people or not. And, the elements that make someone cry, they might be hard to execute, but they're pretty straightforward. You have death, tragedy, loss, suffering. But with comedy, it's so much more intangible. And, invoking this involuntary response of making someone laugh, it's almost magical. I mean, do you feel at this point in your career that you have a pretty decent grasp on why that happens, or at very least how to make that happen? Or is it still a mystery to you?
Well, two things. First of all, I would say that the very subjects you just touched upon that make people cry are also the best subjects to make people laugh as well. Death and tragedy, the things that are hard to process, also produce the deepest and most meaningful laughter as well. And that's one of the things that I'm always curious about on a philosophical level. What is funny? Why is something funny? Why do we need to laugh at things like death or horror? And you realize it's part of this kind of processing that we go through to survive. It's a survival tool. But as far as your actual question goes, no, I don't get it. I have no idea from day to day what's going to be funny. I trust my instincts at this point, and I sort of go with that. But I really don't know why something is funny, what makes people laugh. I have to just sort of take the leap each time that I approach it, because there is no formula. And as soon as you think there is a formula, you're in trouble. I think my whole philosophy has been cracking that code, transcending that formula to see what's next, what's beyond. The comedians that I really respect are always searching for what is beyond the formulaic laugh, and I find that a fascinating subject because it is so much about life.
Well, what are your thoughts on using topics like, death and tragedy and suffering and loss to try and elicit laughter? Because using them to try and elicit tears is very acceptable. But to do that and to make a joke out of it, do you have to tread very lightly for it to not feel exploitive or manipulative?
I think, again, if you look at Seinfeld, you see a lot of examples of dealing with verboten, forbidden subjects. And I think one of the things that Larry David taught me, and that I knew sort of instinctively from being a kid and reading Catch-22 and the kind of things that influenced me as a kid, it's that any subject is fodder for laughter if you can find the right angle to enter the subject. That is, you can't, making cheap exploitive laughs about people who are suffering, I don't find that funny. But finding an angle on the most forbidden subjects will allow you to explore it without exploiting people, without making fun of people, without punching down, as they say. And that laughter, again, if you do find that angle, and we did it very well on Seinfeld, and I've tried to do it through my whole career, including Borat and places like that. That laughter is very, very satisfying to an audience because it's expressing something that has remained unexpressed.
I mean, you talk a lot about how comedy sketches have certain unwritten structural rules for, character and dialogue and verbal humor and length. And, when you first started writing, you already had a pretty firm grasp on these rules, kind of instinctively, just from being such a fan and a student of television growing up. For the casual viewer, can you just break down a few of these conventions? And, have those conventions, have they changed since the early 80s when you first started writing? Or is the blueprint for what makes a sketch work something that's kind of set in stone?
Well, there are a lot of different types of sketches. It's almost like literature. Literature has many different genres, and sketches have many different genres. There's the parody sketch where you take a popular, form, a popular movie or a popular book or a popular TV show, and you sort of find what about it you can make fun of. There's those kind of sketches, but there are also sketches that don't fit any category. And again, that's always been of interest to me. Like I did a lot of parody sketches on Fridays, for instance, but the much more difficult task was to create an original sketch that didn't have any kind of basis in some other popular culture reference, So it's like finding a hook. You're looking for a hook, something that, you think about Matt Foley, the Chris Farley character, that there it's a character who is just funny and you want more of him. You want to see him do his thing. Sometimes it's a concept. There's something about the cone heads, and you see them with their cones and that immediately makes you laugh, and you realize that the cone heads are just outsiders. They're aliens, but they're really just alienated from the environment that we are used to, So there's a lot of different structures and formulas and conceptual ideas that make sketches. And again, the most interesting thing is when someone breaks through all that to come up with an idea that doesn't really fit any specific category.
Yeah, I mean, do you think some of like if you take some of the most beloved Saturday Night Live sketches, for instance, do you think those worked because those conventions were in play, or is it despite that and it works even though it's contrived and that it's part of a formula?
Well, these shows like Fridays or Saturday Night Live have such demands put upon them. They're live shows once a week, and the writers, and you have a lot of writers, 10, 15 writers. So there's pressure to just come up with material. And so there's a lot of scrambling. It's not as intentional as it might seem when you actually watch the show on Saturday. It's during the week, there's just a lot of scrambling that's going on, trying to come up with ideas, trying to come up with a character or a concept or a hook that hasn't been done before and that will make people laugh. And you also, one of the fortunate things that Saturday Night Live has is you come to Saturday Night Live knowing that, you know, there's going to be something funny. And so you're prepared for funniness as an audience. And so it's a little bit easier to make the connection because that is an unspoken language now between the audience and the show too.
So, you know, if you take Seinfeld, for instance, it's almost always listed amongst one of the greatest sitcoms of all time. And it's usually alongside a show like Cheers or Taxi. And what I found fascinating in your book is that you, Larry David, and Jerry Seinfeld, you didn't really grow up on shows like Cheers or Taxi, and they weren't a real direct influence on Seinfeld. And, you know, and instead, the DNA is almost closer to Abbott and Costello or to Three Stooges, where you have these characters just hanging out, having real, relatable conversations. And you really only had one rule on Seinfeld, which I thought was hilarious. It's no hugging, no learning. And I'm wondering, was that in response to other shows at the time that you felt were wading too deep into trying to teach a lesson or to be too sentimental? Where did that come from?
Well, there were two things going on there as well. I mean, one was we loved Abbott and Costello or the Three Stooges, and think about it, we were watching those shows in reruns 20, 30 years, 40 years after they had been on TV already. So they also had a certain resonance with kids growing up in New York at that time. There was also a certain bleakness to the Three Stooges, and especially Abbott and Costello. I often compare it to Beckett, because it's like two guys living in a room, going nowhere, you know, like spinning their wheels. It's a very sort of bleak thing. And they do it week after week after week, you know, episode after episode. And no, they never say, oh, you know what, we should get a job and stop this, you know, stop struggling. No, they keep trying to get by in their foolish ways. And that's what you love about it. It's honest. It's really more, even though it's crazy and surreal, it's more honest and more like life than many of the sitcoms that you see now and certainly then, where you were given this false morality, you know, where everything works out in the end, which isn't how life is. And I think one of the reasons that Seinfeld still exists as an entity is because we did not give easy answers. We said, like Abbott and Costello, they're going to be back next week doing the same thing. They don't learn their lessons, just like we as people rarely learn our lessons, you know, and that is a great lesson, I think, for people to remember. It's like, you don't want to be lectured to. You don't want to be talked down to. We really treated the audience like equals, like partners in crime.
I mean, was that intentional, or was it just by what you were inspired with growing up? Like, in other words, do you think the unique perspective of Seinfeld, was that a result of not being shaped by traditional structures of somebody like James L. Brooks, where it almost always ends on a very high note?
Yeah, I think there is something to that. I mean, again, it's a combination of like our instinct, what made us laugh, what we found funny, and trusting in that, really, and rejection of those kind of comedy norms that a lot of shows had. And there were really well-written, well-done shows. I mean, the James L. Brooks shows, the Norma Lear shows, they were great shows. But they were more in that formula, you know, and they kind of relied on that formula of no matter how bad Archie was, at the end of the show, there would be some kind of redemption. When in truth, when you knew guys like Archie, they didn't have redemption at the end of each episode.
Yeah.
Their life was not about redemption. It was about believing what they believed in and being stubborn about it, you know? And so that was something that we looked at, just like you look at the sketch formula and you go, that's a formula that I reject. You know, let's see what happens if we don't do that. And inadvertently, we wound up really connecting with the audience on a very primal level because of that.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting. You had a line in the book, and you described Seinfeld as being more influenced by Jim Jarmusch than a contemporary classic sitcom.
Yeah, yeah. And Charles Bukowski and Harvey Pekar, the underground cartoonist and writer, and R. Crumb and people like that, because that they were presenting a world that wasn't about drama. It wasn't about contrivance. You know, Jim Jarmusch's movies, one of the things I love about them, I just watched one of his movies the other night, is there's no contrivance to it. You know, it's just, it was Patterson actually with Adam Driver. It was fantastic, but it was just it could have been. You could take that same situation and make it into a sitcom. It's a bus driver who's a poet, and he has a wife who has certain crazy dreams, and he goes to work every day, and he has little incidents and conflicts, but you know, it's really about that mundane reality, you know, and it's not faking it, it's not contriving it, it's not heightening it in a kind of fake way,
and doesn't necessarily have a clear arc that's resolved at the end.
Exactly. And so things like The Chinese Restaurant, those shows were really breakthrough to me because it was just about people waiting for a table, you know, and that's very Jim Jarmusch like, you know, kind of sitcom version of a Jim Jarmusch type of, you know, episode, because nothing really happens and yet so much happens.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
It's filled, it's dense with incidents, but not fake incident. It's the kind of thing that anybody who's waited for a table has been through, you know, and finding a way to make that artful is something that I really admire.
You know, a lot of comics and writers talk about how they wrote jokes for other comics earlier in their career. And that practice always struck me as so strange because, you know, unlike music where an emerging band might start off by playing covers of another band, in comedy, if there's one cardinal rule, it's that you don't steal jokes from other comics. And even the fact that the word steal is used, it really speaks to the importance that's placed on original material. So if you write a joke for somebody else, like how exactly does that work? I mean, can the writer use it themselves at some point, or is it essentially like a copyright or an IP transfer done with a handshake deal? And what's the standard rate for a great joke?
Well, I mean, again, I was doing that in the late 70s. So I could tell you that, to answer your first part of your question, it's burned for the writer once he sells it to the comedian. It would not be cool for the writer to use that same joke that he has sold to the comedian. That is now the comedian's property. It would be like me selling you a car and then coming around and driving that car whenever I felt like it, you know? It wouldn't be cool. It's your car now, you know?
And that's strictly a handshake deal, right?
Well, it's a handshake deal. There are no contracts. At least, again, when I was doing it, it was very, very informal. And I would literally have jokes on a piece of paper and go up to comedians that I recognized, and I would ask them if they wanted to buy a joke. And in the case of most of those comedians, including like Jay Leno, who bought my first joke, they would say, okay, well, let me try it out on stage. If they were bought on contingency.
They get to go for a test drive first, basically?
Yes, yeah, exactly. They would go on stage, and if it got a laugh, they would give me $10. And that's how much I got for jokes in those days, $10.
Wow.
And then eventually there were some writers who got more, and eventually that could be turned into a lucrative job. But for me, it was always about $10. And I was always scrambling, and I was still, you know, parking cars and doing stuff like that on the, you know, to sort of make money.
Well, I want to get your input on the process of TV directing, because I think most people have a pretty decent grasp on the role of a feature film director. But with a TV show director, it seems like, you know, the script is written, the sets are built, the characters, for the most part, are probably extremely well developed already. Like, what is the skill set for being an episodic TV director? Is it more about just keeping the train moving and staying on schedule, as opposed to having to oversee this grand creative responsibility that the auteur feature director has? What's the difference?
Well, Curb was very different than most of the traditional sitcoms. Curb was done with handheld cameras. There was no real script, so we were kind of making it up. And me, as the director, I was very deeply involved in the writing and in the creative content of the show. And I was like, sort of cajoling performances and lines and content out of the actors. And with each take, it was a discovery process. So when you're a director of something like Curb, you are part of the creative process from the beginning, because all the directors of Curb were also producers. So we were there when, the original ideas were coming up. And then we would be part of the process, of course, of rendering it in front of the cameras. A TV sitcom director is a very, very different job. It's more like what you're talking about, where there's a script and there are cameras that are set. There's 3 cameras or 4 cameras, and they're on pedestals. And basically, you are trying to kind of capture a play, is what it really boils down to. And you're making sure that you're getting the basic coverage. You need a close up here when somebody says something. You need a wide shot to see this reaction. And it's a little mechanical. It's not as creative. Now, there are some TV directors of sitcoms like James Burrows who bring more of this kind of Curb-like sensibility to their directing of traditional sitcoms. So they because they're funny guys, and James Burrows comes from a very funny lineage. His father, Abe Burrows, was a great comedy writer. So he's finding business. He's improving lines, and he's finding cuts and shots that might enhance the comedy that is on the page. But most TV directors are basically just trying to capture what the script says and not blow it, not miss the big shot, not miss that close up, not miss that reaction shot, and keep as you say, keep the train on time, essentially.
So in the Seinfeld example, like if you were just a kind of one-off director for hire that was brought in to direct 1 or 2 episodes, you would have relatively little creative input other than blocking, essentially. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think that's very, very true. And even the blocking on a show like Seinfeld, the actors and Larry, of course, but the actors, and I would stand behind Larry for all the rehearsals that went on for those first few seasons that I was on the show, and be suggesting things to Larry. But Larry also had a great sense of how lines should be done, where people should be. And then you had the actors themselves, Jason, Michael, Julia, and Jerry, and they really were to some degree directing themselves. After the first couple of episodes, they knew where they should be, they knew where they should move, they knew what kind of business they should be doing, and they just needed to have that captured, really, because they were doing most of that blocking and rehearsing on their own, really, without any kind of input except from Larry, who was watching it to see if he could tweak or fine tune the performances, if he needed lines to top the lines that were there. And that was really the creative process. And the director in that case was really responsible for just making sure it was all on camera.
Got it. Well, I want to switch gears for a minute and move on to another chapter of your life.
Sure.
And I guess a good place to start is, can you talk a little bit about why you lost your sense of smell?
Yes. When we did Borat, part of Sacha had all these psychological ploys that he would use on these targets who were going to be the subject of the scene. He would give them presents. He would kiss them, especially if he was a man. He would kiss. If it was a man, he would kiss them. If it was a woman, he would only shake their hands, or sometimes not even want to touch them. And each of these things were very purposeful to see what this person, how pliable this person would be during the actual scene, And so one of his most effective ploys was to never bathe. And so he went through weeks and weeks, and Azamah too, his sidekick, the producer, they never bathed, and basically wore the same clothes for weeks on end until they really, really stunk. I mean, seriously smelled bad. And so I had to be close to them all the time. And people would say to me, "How do you handle it, man? How do you stand next to them? They're like they reek, they smell terrible. They're like the worst kind of person living in the sidewalk. They stink." And I realized at a certain point that I wasn't smelling it, and everybody else was smelling it, but I didn't smell it, and I was the closest to them. And I realized that as a kind of survival tool for my body, for my brain, it shut off my sense of smell, and I stopped smelling things, and it took me quite a while.
Like an involuntary defense mechanism?
Yes, I hadn't noticed it happened, but it happened. And it was a way for me to be able to sort of stay close to them and function without going, whoa, I have to, I have to take a break here. And it really helped me, stay close to the action during the making of the movie. And then when it was over, it took quite a while, actually. But eventually, my sense of smell started to finally come back, and I was able to smell again.
What, other than just character development, what purpose would him smelling that bad have in terms of priming the subjects to act a certain way towards him? What do you think his intent was?
Well, if people again, if people were okay with it, if they didn't go, "Look, man, I can't do the interview. He just smells too bad," then we knew they were going to be a difficult interview, and it wasn't probably going to go well. But if they sucked it up and tried to accept that and be tolerant of it, then we knew that they were going to be tolerant of his bad behavior, of his rude questions, of the things that Borat would eventually get to.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things I found really interesting to read about is how much psychology went into the production of Borat. And, the way these situations were engineered and the calculated priming of the subjects was really fascinating to read about. And, you talk about, for example, how you would give the subjects this little speech before shooting telling them, "Don't worry, I'm going to be right off camera. If you need me, I'll just jump in, just say my name." And, this gave them, quote, as you put it, "the illusion of security, which allows complacency to seep in and create cognitive dissonance." Now, of course, once you started shooting, you would completely disappear from their line of sight and you were not there to save them. But I mean, the paradox is that a scene as outrageous as Borat carrying a bag of his own feces at a fancy Southern dinner party, it's actually built on a very meticulous and deliberate process. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, so true that in fact that scene was shot probably 4 different times in 4 different cities, because when you were done with a scene like that and the police had been called, you couldn't just mount that scene again. You had to kind of get out of town. So we would literally go out of town to another town and mount it again. And what we did with each iteration of the scene was we would analyze it afterwards, like what worked, what didn't work, what does it still need. And like the feces, for instance, was one of the things that was added in the scene that you see in the movie. That was the only time we actually, I think, did it with the feces, because that was an idea that came up between the second to last time and the last time we did it. Also, Lunel, the prostitute who he eventually marries, Borat marries at the end, her showing up at the door, that was an added thing as well. So that's part of the rewrite process on a show like Borat, is to be able to do it more than once until you finally are excavating all the gold that's available to you in that scene,
Yeah, there's something interesting that I learned in the book is that, everything you see on the screen is, quote unquote, real, but it's done multiple times and edited together. Did I read that correctly? Yeah.
Well, not, and sometimes it's done once and you just get it and you have it. You're not going to do any better and you move on. But a lot of the scenes need to be tweaked, like scenes in Seinfeld or scenes in Curb or scenes anywhere in comedy. You want to be able to rewrite, you want to be able to add and make it better. And that was the way we were able to do it on Borat. There were no take twos. So instead of that, we would analyze the scene after we were done, do more rewriting on the scene, and then book another Southern dinner in some other state or some other city.
So you do another take one to another set of characters, essentially. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And sometimes there were things we did like the cage fight in Bruno where we were able to intercut. We did it twice, and we were able to intercut. Or like in Bruno, when Bruno appears on the talk show with the baby OJ, we shot that I think 3 times, and because of that, we were able to actually intercut the 3 different audiences, so it seems very seamless, like it's one time that we did it.
I mean, obviously, you had all of the releases signed and completed before you started filming. Was there any wiggle room for people to back out at that point?
No. No, they not only did we have them sign, we always wanted them to sign a release beforehand. Not everybody did, but almost everybody did. And part of the release signing process was also giving them $100, like a small payment. And for whatever reason, legally, that was a binding contract then. So they had made a binding contract with us that they could not get out of. And they thought when it was over that it would be easy to get out of, but it wasn't. They were legally bound. And if they had read the fine print on the release, which I advise for everybody, and I don't do it myself, but you should, it said we could do anything we want, essentially, in the fine print. We could do anything we want with this footage. You have no power over this anymore once you agree to this.
You had them.
And people would sign.
Yeah.
People would sign it. Now, other people were reluctant to sign it, and sometimes you would get a release on camera. That also was fairly binding, where you would just go, "Are you giving us permission to shoot the scene?" And they would go, "Yes," and that would be okay. It wasn't quite as binding as the document. But that sometimes worked. And then there were people that wouldn't sign it, but because it was so rich, we would go for it and hope that we could get them to sign it afterwards. And sometimes that worked out.
Amazing. Well, I want to get your opinion on your takeaways from the making of Borat versus Bruno and kind of what they say about the state of our culture or the state of America. Because in many ways, you talk about in this book how Borat it spoke to our sense of tolerance and acceptance. I mean, you really primed the subjects before they met Borat and emphasized the fact that he was this kind of innocent, well-meaning, fish out of water character who just wasn't familiar with our societal norms. And people were surprisingly patient with him. And I think that unexpected tolerance and lenience from the people was really at the core of the tension at what makes it so funny. When you made Bruno, it seemed to uncover something much darker about our country. And you talk about how it exposed simmering hate and prejudice and violent tendencies. Did that surprise you? And what was that experience like?
It was shocking, really. We did not, of all the things, we always try to stay one step ahead of everybody when we make these movies, And one of the things you saw on Borat, as you point out, is when Borat came into a scene, he seemed, his suit was kind of, unfashionable. He was very clueless. And so people's instinct was to help, and to be patient and tolerant, as you said. When Bruno walked in, and Sacha's so tall and he wore platform shoes, first of all, he towered over everybody, and he was all dressed up. He was wearing makeup. He was wearing very tight clothes. He was very flamboyantly gay, and that immediately had a different reaction. That initial exposure was negative. People were very negative to him when he walked into the scene, as opposed to Borat, when they were very welcoming, and then they would kind of fall into the trap. With Bruno, they were very resistant, and that was a big difference. And besides that, being gay, people felt even though Borat was an anti-Semite and a rapist, he was straight, and weirdly enough, but Bruno was gay, and that was enough for people to be angry and hateful towards him. And so the level of homophobia that manifested in physical violence really kind of caught us by surprise. And Sacha had to go through a lot of physical abuse because of that in that movie. And I think that was one of the things that kind of convinced him that he didn't want, he started to have a family, he was married, he had children. I don't think he wanted to risk the risking of the life was much more present in Bruno than it was in Borat.
Do you think the timing has as much to do with the content of those two movies? If you had made them in reverse, do you think that they would have gotten the same reaction? Like, I mean, in other words, has there been an erosion of that tolerance in our society since Borat came out?
It's a great question. I mean, it's very hard to answer. I mean, Borat, kind of still speaks to, the country to me is more divided than ever, and the extreme right wing hate and lack of tolerance is more present than ever. And so, in some ways, a lot of people misinterpreted Borat and thought that he was like perpetrating those very values rather than satirizing and making fun of them. And I think in some ways that would still be true today if people hadn't been exposed to him. And I think at the same time, people would be resistant to Bruno because of his flamboyantly gay, sort of demeanor. And I think that ultimately human nature doesn't change that much. The country's in worse shape. And so I think it would be even more extreme today in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think
Both
you're
the
probably right.
Bruno and the Borat. Yeah, I think if Bruno came first, it's possible it would not have been the phenomena that Borat was. The country and the world were really ready. They didn't know they were. They didn't know they needed Borat, but when they got Borat, they really responded to it. And I think if Bruno had come first, it might not have had that same phenomena kind of quality to it.
Did it bother you at all, the people who basically revered Borat but didn't understand who he was trying to parody? In other words, I mean, you see that, it'd be like somebody watching the Colbert Report and actually believing that Stephen Colbert
Right.
is that person. I mean, was there an element of it was frustrating how that character was misunderstood by people that you were supposed to be making fun of?
Only in retrospect. I mean, I didn't at the time. My goal was to make the funniest movie possible. That was our agenda, was making the funniest movie possible, and I didn't care whether the people understood or not, or what was going on in their minds. As long as the scenes were working, I was happy and exhilarated by that, and it didn't matter to me. I mean, I kind of had a cynical view of those people. We were looking at people who were, already kind of racist or sexist or intolerant, and so it was not a problem. We talked to white supremacists and Bruno. In both movies we met a lot of very unsavory people.
Yeah.
And so. It didn't matter to me whether they understood or not. It mattered to me whether the scene worked or not. Just like it would if I was shooting a scripted movie. It's like that ultimately was all that mattered to me, was getting the scene, making sure we got the scene, doing whatever I could to make sure we got the scene, and then moving on to the next scene.
So comedy first, funny first,
Yeah,
hugging, lesson learning, maybe later.
yeah. Well, and also you knew you were never going to be there again. So you had to really capitalize on this moment because you didn't know whether you were going to be able to shoot the scene again or, find somebody as good as this person. So you wanted to capitalize on every single moment. It's very much an in the moment filmmaking experience.
Yeah. One of the things that really stood out in Comedy Samurai is how honest and unvarnished you are when describing some of the famous people that you've worked with and crossed paths with. I mean, you talk about collaborating with Sacha Baron Cohen, Larry David, Robert Redford, Bob Dylan, and not all of those characterizations are real positive always. And you also go into detail about your friendship with Rick Rubin and how you eventually kind of had this realization that you just didn't really enjoy his company more, or at least didn't share the same priorities or values. And, unlike so many memoirs that take a real sanitized or polite tone about celebrities, you're very blunt and direct in this book. And I'm wondering, have you experienced any blowback or burnt bridges since this book came out?
Well, I think the burnt bridges already had happened. So I felt kind of liberated in a way. I knew that, my relationship with Sasha had disintegrated, my relationship with Rick, my relationship with even Larry, those relationships had broken down already. So I didn't feel any kind of need to censor myself about them. I'd already been living with the reality of that for a while. I think the thing that makes it work in the book is I'm also unfailingly honest about myself and my own failures. I don't I don't like put myself on a pedestal while I look down on these people, you know. I see us all as humans with tremendous deep flaws, you know. And as long as I talked about myself honestly, I felt obligated to talk honestly about everybody else as well. And I know I haven't gotten any blowback because I think all of that sort of had happened already. And, you know, we were already all past it in a certain sense. And plus, when it comes to someone like Sasha or Larry, I really spend a lot of time, you know, talking about how much I admire them, how much I respect them, how much I love them for a long, long time. And I'm also very philosophical about the idea that time goes on and relationships fall apart. You know, marriages fall apart, friendships fall apart for all kinds of reasons. We deal with loss as we get older, and loss comes in many different forms. And that's one of the things you have to learn to ironically live with is loss.
Has this book opened up dialogue with any of those people, like whether it's Larry or Sasha or Rick or Bob Dylan?
No, Bob Dylan, I kind of knew from the time we finished the movie that I probably would never talk to him again, but not because we did well. I mean, his last words to me were, "You were a gallant captain," you know? It's like the best compliment I ever got. And so, but I knew like from his history that he's not a guy who has, you don't meet with him for coffee and hang out, you know?
He doesn't have a lot of buddies.
He doesn't have buddies. He's not that kind of guy. We had an incredible collaboration, pretty much unprecedented in his history, certainly in mine, but in his as well. He doesn't usually collaborate on something long term like that, like we did, you know. I was completely satisfied. I wasn't looking for the hang, you know. I was looking for the work, and I got a chance to do that. So with Bob, it's a little bit different, you know. But with the others, no, I don't have any contact with them. So, and there's no, I don't think there's any. They all have their lives as I have mine. They're pretty filled up,
Yeah.
honestly. And as you get older and you have children and grandchildren and, you know, you're trying to get your work done and there's so much to do that I think for all these people, they have to we all have to live our lives, you know. And if at some point those things crisscross again, that, you know, that could happen. But even when you leave projects with friendship, you know, you often go separate ways and never see that person again in show business anyway.
Yeah. Well, one of my favorite books about Hollywood is The Kid Stays in the Picture by legendary studio head Robert Evans. And for the listeners who may not be familiar, you know, Robert Evans helped produce some of the greatest films of that era, including Rosemary's Baby, The Godfather, Chinatown. But because he was running Paramount as a studio head rather than being an independent producer, he was essentially an employee, and he never really shared in the ownership or the profits of any of the films that he helped create. And I get the sense that there are some parallels with your career in terms of you being deeply involved in Seinfeld and Curb Your Enthusiasm. And, you know, you've also talked about renting small apartments and sometimes struggling financially, even while being tied to some of the most valuable TV properties in history. How do you reconcile the irony of being so creatively involved with these shows, but not really sharing in the wealth they generated? Is that something that is still an issue for you?
No, I mean, first of all, I am two things. First, I never did anything for money. I didn't do Seinfeld thinking, oh, wow, I'm going to get rich from this show. I thought it was going to be canceled.
Yeah. But I mean, in fairness, I feel like those guys didn't either at the beginning. I mean, that was never the inception.
Right. No, that's true. That's true. None of these projects were like money-making projects, like doing an Avengers, a Marvel movie or something. So I never chose projects based on the potential lucrative quality to it. You know, I chose them because instinctively, artistically, they spoke to me. That was one thing. Another thing was, yes, I found myself, I was a worker. You know, I was a laborer, basically, and I was a well-paid laborer, but I was always a laborer. I never participated in the ownership of these projects, you know. And basically, even though I didn't, things like Seinfeld or Curb or Borat opened so many doors for me to keep me working, to work on more risky things. You know, I came out of Borat, and I was paid minimum to do Borat, but it gave me the opportunity, the leverage to do like Religulous and to do other projects that I really wanted to do. And so I used those successes to allow me to do other projects that I had passion about. And I didn't worry about money. I usually was making enough money to live well. And at times, like during my divorce, yes, there was a period where all my assets were frozen. I couldn't use the ATM. I couldn't get gas for my car in the middle of all of this. And so, yeah, I come from very meager background to begin with, so it didn't really kind of freak me out, And I also didn't want to be one of those people who lives in a bubble and is kind of detached from reality, and that's been important to me as well.
So you found a way to almost find a silver lining in either the experience or the doors that it opened for those projects rather than focusing on not getting a piece of the Castle Rock syndication deal, for instance.
Yeah, I mean the book I think is an illustration of like how grateful I am for all the things that I've been allowed to do, and money is not a big part of that really. I mean, again, I've been able to pay my rent, I've been able to put a little money away, I've been able to, help people out when they needed it. I've used money the way I feel money should be used, and not to not to splurge, not to indulge. That kind of stuff is just of no interest to me anyway. I like keeping it real, as they say.
Yeah.
So that's been okay. And it gives me I'm able to work. I'm able to work on really cool stuff. That's been my goal from the very beginning, and I've been able to continue doing that. And I can't be grateful enough for something like that.
Well, we always like to end the podcast by asking our guests to plug something that they aren't directly involved in, but they feel isn't getting enough attention, whether it's a book, a movie, a TV show, an artist. Is there something you want to give a little shine to that you've really been inspired by lately?
Well, it's funny. There's two writers that I've been turned on to in the last couple of months that have blown my mind. One is a man named William Boyle, who writes mysteries, but they are really substantial, densely detailed mysteries, and they take place in Brooklyn, in the neighborhoods that I grew up in. And so they're much more than just kind of genre things. They're literature with kind of emotionally gripping stories that really suck you in. And I can't wait to get back to it today. In fact, I'm reading a book called The Saint of Narrow Street. Fantastic book. And then another writer that I discovered, I didn't discover him. I mean, he's been here, and I finally got exposed to him, is a man named John Tottenham, who has written a novel called Service, and he's a poet, and he writes these kind of short stories and essays, and he's a very kind of like a traveler, and very much in the genre of Hubert Selby or Bukowski, but very much his own. And I have found his work, even though he talks about the bleakest circumstances, I have found his work to be extremely exhilarating. And I'm always looking forward to it.
Oh, that's good. That's such a great feeling to be excited about getting back to a book,
Yes. Yeah. And I've been doing that lately. I hadn't read fiction for a long time. I really was kind of focused on nonfiction. And so the last year or so, I started to, through science fiction and other things, I started to read fiction again. And that got me excited and let me kind of enter worlds that I would never, of course, enter into. And sometimes it's hard to find the movie or TV show that you want to watch. It's great to have a book to always turn back to. And also another thing I'll recommend, I watched last night, in fact. I have a very, very distant cousin who died last year. His name is William Klein. He was like my grandmother's first cousin. And he was a very famous photographer. And he did great street photography, and you've probably seen his photographs, very famous photographs.
He had an amazing show at the International Center of Photography on the Lower East Side here last year. It was fantastic. Really beautiful show.
He did fashion photography, but he did a lot of street photography, and he made a few movies as well. I watched one of his movies last night, which was called Who Are You, Polly Magoo? And it's on the Criterion Channel, and it's kind of an avant-garde satire of media and the fashion world, and it's kind of brilliant in its execution. And again, it's not something that you would normally get turned on to or get exposed to. So I'm happy to be able to tell people to check that out.
That's amazing. Are you familiar? I learned this when I saw that show, that he was working on a documentary about Little Richard for years. And then at some point, Little Richard just kind of ghosted him and disappeared. And he had so much footage already that he cast people to play Little Richard in the rest of the documentary. Like, I've never seen it. I don't know if it's available, but they had some clips of it in a story in the show. It was like a fascinating story.
I'm sure it's amazing, and I didn't know anything about that. And I will actually, after we're done, I'm going to go try to find out about that.
Well, Larry, it's been such a pleasure getting a chance to get inside your brain. You've contributed so much to, comedy culture, and just get the plug in one more time. Go check out Comedy Samurai by Larry Charles. It's a fantastic read, and it's really good insight into a creative, very funny mind. So thanks for taking the time, and hopefully our paths will cross soon.
Thank you very much. It was great to meet you. Great to talk to you. Happy to do it again.
Right on.
Okay, man.
Thanks for listening, and a huge thanks to today's guest for dropping in. If you enjoyed this episode, do us a favor and take a minute to rate, review, follow, or subscribe. This episode of The Plug contains original theme music by Andrew Van Weingarten and Dan Drohan. Mixing and sound design by Matt Boynton at Ultraviolet Audio. Logo and branding by Italic at italic-studio.com. And you can check out my photography at justinj.com. Thanks again, and be sure to check out the archive and tune in for future conversations.